as young adult novels go, you could do a lot worse than Starship Troopers. Hello and welcome back to the Pillbox, episode 3. Apologies for the delay. This is in fact a re-recording of an episode that I did about 2 months ago at this point. But while editing it and life accelerating in the meantime, I decided it was bad, so I had to redo it. So we're redoing the whole thing from scratch. This is about Robert Heinlein's one and only tour de force, Starship Troopers, which I would characterize as an ideal young adult novel. It's good. Now, why would I call it a young adult novel? It is short, for the most part. Well, not that short, I guess. It's a little under 300 pages, 275 in this edition, and easy to read. It is enjoyable. It is interesting. It's action-packed. It's got guns and violence and bugs and aliens, and somewhat infamously, lengthy diatribes on citizenship, civil politics, the philosophy behind them, and Heinlein's own beliefs about civics, which are, at the very least, thought-provoking and good enough to be challenging to the average, 13 or 14-year-old, which I think is the appropriate age to be reading this book. So we'll get into it briefly. We'll be looking at the book in brief, as well as the film by the Dutch hack Paul Verhoeven. Awful film, but a good book. So strap in. This is a program in which I discuss books, usually, and sometimes film. And in this case, we're doing both. So, on with the show. Now, a little bit of background about the book. Robert Heinlein is a legend, or was a legend of science fiction. Surely you've probably heard of him before. And Starship Troopers is one of his most famous books nowadays, as is Stranger in a Strange Land and The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Neither of those I've read. This is the only book of his I've read so far. I'm inclined to read more. This has left a very good impression, so I might get around to it, but I don't know. He wrote this in a span of about 6 weeks after the U.S. government announced that they were no longer conducting atmospheric nuclear testing. He wasn't too happy about that, as one might imagine. Reading this book, they're throwing nukes like footballs and using them as almost a form of small arms because of the scale at which the war is being conducted in Starship Troopers. But he effectively wrote this in response to the U.S. government moving away from certain kinds of nuclear testing to prioritize others and anticipating a bit of a nuclear de-escalation in its programs. To some extent. This was 1959. Now, keep in mind the fact that this was in 1959 because this book is ahead of its time in terms of speculative fiction, and we'll touch on that in a minute. But this was written in 1959. Very impressive. Very impressive. So, broad overview of the book, the summary of this novel. It's really just a military war story. It starts off with a kid fresh out of high school trying to decide what he's going to do with his life, and doesn't take him long to decide that he's going to go into the military. Now, this takes place in the relatively far future, especially in 59. I don't think they give a date. If they do, apologies. The very first chapter starts off in media res in the middle of a drop and an attack on a group of aliens called Skinnies that are civilized, more or less, kind of like ourselves, I guess. They have cities and buildings and places of worship, and the first chapter kicks off with them conducting a military operation on one of their planets. But then it backtracks a little bit, and it goes back to really the beginning of this character's story arc. Another reason why this is good for 13, 14-year-olds. It is, in effect, a Bildungsroman. It is, in effect, a coming-of-age story, as the young protagonist goes to boot camp, spends about half of the book in training in order to be an enlisted man, and overcomes various trials, one of which being the trial of just the training process itself before war is declared against the bugs and he is shipped off to fight. Now, for those of you who have only seen the film, put that on the back burner, because a lot of stuff that we'll be talking about in the book shows up in some version, some form in the book, but it's really nothing like the film. So we'll talk about the film in a little bit, briefly. I'm not going to spend that much time on it, I hope. That's not my plan. But the book is quite a bit different. So he goes off to boot camp. He signs up with two of his friends. One of them is sort of a brainiac type, and the other is a girl, a friend of his. And they all sign up, and you never see them ever again. You see the girl very briefly towards the end, and they have a catch-up conversation around the time that he is in officer training much later. But his other friend, you never see him again, which is kind of true to life. That happens. Meanwhile, while in training, he goes into the infantry, basically to be cannon fodder. Little does he know, but that's how it goes. So, training, like I said, lasts roughly half of the book. And there's a couple pieces we want to touch on regarding the training, as well as the emphasis on what the book's focus is. So, like I said earlier, the book is very much ahead of its time for speculative fiction in terms of the tech that's described. We'll talk about that. And the attention to detail in various aspects, like the civilization that he's a part of is, while it's not gone into too much detail, you get a lot of hints about what kind of civilization this is, or what kind of society it is, what kind of government runs it. Frankly, I would call it a liberal government, although most would probably call it some sort of fascist regime, which is rather a joke, I think. Certainly militaristic, but ultimately I think it's a rather liberal government. Yeah, we'll just start off with that, actually. So, the kind of government that he serves under. In this society of Starship Troopers, only those with military service are allowed to vote. Usually this shows up in the film, too. There's several lengthy expositions. I called them diatribes earlier. They're not really diatribes. They're more organized than that. But they're expositions, some of which are quotes from different characters, such as the protagonist, Rico's social studies teacher, his civics teacher from high school, whom he remains in contact with. This is not the same person that he deploys under, unlike in the film, as well as words from Rico himself, because the book is told quasi like a diary. It's not like a diary quite. It's told in that ambiguous first-person, subjective, limited knowledge sense, but also in the past tense, so it's hard to tell when within the scope of the story that the book is actually written, and it's also not really written because it's just taking place as events are occurring. So it's kind of like a diary, but kind of not. It's just the character's interior dialogue, interior monologue. So as a result of that, sometimes he'll have thoughts about civics or technology or whatever that are just poured out onto the page, and you get that glimpse of what he considers to be society. Now, his view is, we would certainly consider it rather conservative today, as well as at the time. You know, he's pro-military, pro-humanity in this case, because there's a one-world government. At least that's I think I might be wrong on that, but at some point there had been a catastrophic war in the past among human beings, and that resulted in the coming together of a one-world government. And the reason I call that government liberal is they have the vote. And they take voting very seriously. Apparently the system of voting and suffrage actually works, unlike it does in real life, or for the most part. Maybe it works in real life. Who knows? It works well enough. But it works for them. And one of the ways that they get it to work, in theory, is, like I said, as you probably know from the film, only those with military service are allowed to vote. They are the ones that have some ounce of political power. Interestingly, the vote is not valued as a... Because of this, the vote is, one, not valued as sort of a human right in this society, but rather a privilege. And secondly, as Rico's conversation with his own father near the beginning turns out, voting's not really something a lot of civilians are interested in having in the first place. If they want it, they'll go enlist and become some sort of military figure. Otherwise, many of them decide not to because it's not worth the trouble, it's not worth the responsibility. They'd much rather not have to deal with it, which I think is pretty realistic. A good view of voting, frankly. If only we had more people that considered voting in that way, but we don't. So that's the civilization they're living under. It is an expansive military doctrine. They are pro conquering, but also desiring to maintain peace in a galaxy that is, you get the impression, is relatively hostile. We're not talking about Warhammer levels of hostile, but certainly relatively hostile. Which brings us to the plurality of aliens here. There's only two that are discussed. You do get the impression there are others, but it's never touched on. You have these skinnies that are referred to. They're aliens more or less like human beings. They have cities and buildings and recognizable social structures and families and things like that. You don't see a whole or hear a whole lot about them outside of a couple of engagements, and you find out as the war goes on that they end up suing for peace, maybe becoming an ally. I don't know if that's fair to call them that. And then you have the bugs, and the bugs are the famous ones. Those are really the enemies of the book, are the bugs. And you can think of the bugs effectively the same way they're depicted in the film. That's really the only thing the film gets right, I think, is the depiction of the bugs. But like I said, we'll get to the movie when we get to the movie. We're sticking with the book for now. Second thing the book does well, we'll get back to the plot, but second thing the book does well is the speculative fiction aspect of it. Heinlein spends a lot of time talking about technology. Not a massive amount, but a lot. About the same amount of time as he spends discussing the civics and this sort of political philosophy that's in the book. The tech is cool. If you haven't read Starship Troopers, you will immediately know what he's talking about because he coined some of this stuff. And I'm talking about the suits, the mobile suits they've got. I'm pretty sure the entire idea of a technical soldier mobile suit apparatus comes from this book. I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure it comes from this book. If it doesn't come from this book, then the idea gets a massive upgrade and it sort of becomes the way that we think of it today, of like an exosuit, exoskeleton techno suit. That's from this. You're talking about these machines that you get into and then you pilot by moving your limbs around, like the thing from Aliens, like the machine exosuits in Edge of Tomorrow. Pretty good action movie if you're into action movies. Like any kind of exosuit. You could almost make an argument that the Gundam franchise is kind of like this. I would hesitate on that because conceptually they're a little similar, but I think the scale of the Gundams and the mobile suits in the Gundam series is much different than the scale of these things. In these things, you get the impression that they're big, but we're talking like bulldozer big, small tank big, not the size of a building, which is what the Gundams are in most of those series. Turn A, it's a little smaller than that, but you get the idea. He goes into a lot of detail about these machines, and the reason he goes into so much detail about these machines is because the military tactics that he describes require that level of detail, because he's talking about deploying these guys across miles of front, and you have one dude who's holding down an entire sector or whatever with this, because this machine is so capable and because the soldiers are trained to sort of operate within these suits like their second skin. And these suits have flamethrowers. They've got a cannon on them. They've got a nuclear device that shoots nuclear bombs, tactical nuclear bombs. They've got grenades that will wipe out city blocks. I mean, these things are just nuts and really cool. Which brings me to one of the only downsides to the book, in my opinion, is generally speaking, fiction, in my opinion, storytelling is a lot more than describing ideas and describing set pieces, which is, I think, what you could classify a mobile suit as. And there's a lot of the book is just that. I wouldn't say it's all of the book by any stretch, because the book does have a good story to it, but it is a lot of the book, maybe a third of it. It's a sizable amount. Might be exaggerating, but it's a sizable amount. And the only problem is, if you're making a video game or you're shooting a film, the amount of work you have to do to describe a particular prop or setting, you don't have to do that much work. You know, the back end has to do the work, like the developers of your game. You've got to, and your conceptual artists, concept artists have to do a lot of work. But in terms of presenting it on the screen, whether it's a film or a game, you know, the game has to be fun, the film has to look good. It just takes a few establishing shots and a few, if we're looking at film, you have establishing shots of the setting, and you can see, so long as the set designer has done the right job, the stage designer's done the right job, the prop guy has done the right job, the armorer has done his job. You just get the whole idea of the setting within a couple of shots. That's a few seconds, maybe a minute, if you're taking your time. And in terms of the prop of the mobile suit, again, a couple of shots, a couple of minutes, maybe some dialogue, some expositionary dialogue, and you're done. You're set. You've got the whole idea right there. In the book, it takes pages because he's going through painstaking detail about this. And I would say that's a drawback to the book, but you can't really get rid of it because it has to be there. Because without it, the book doesn't make quite as much sense. Because the book isn't just a military story. It's a particular kind of military story that only functions in the science fiction environment. Without the explanation of the props and the settings and things like this, he can't do, the main character simply can't do the stuff that he's tasked with doing. So, for instance, if you were going to take this story and remove all of the science fiction elements from it and just take the story and like transplant it into World War II or Korea, it would be very different, because you'd be losing a lot of what makes the story work, which is not really a problem for Heinlein. It's not a mark against the book itself. It's just a consequence of the fact this is what speculative fiction is. It's what science fiction is. It just doesn't really work in real life. But that said, very minor complaint, and if we ignore that and just treat it for what it is, which is speculative fiction, then it's fine. So, moving on, this is starting to get on a little bit on in time, so I want to pick up the pace here. This speculative fiction aspect requires an attention to detail, and this attention to detail goes over into the military aspects of the book as well. He spends a lot of time not just discussing the training, and like I said, he spends half the book in boot camp, learning to be an effective soldier, an enlisted man, but also depicting troop life. It's obvious that Heinlein himself had military experience that shows up in the book. In fact, this book is probably the best, certainly the best I've read, but probably the best out there that describes military life. Yeah, I could be wrong. Who am I to say? But it's certainly the best that I've read that depicts it accurately. It doesn't glamorize it, but it also doesn't present it as being necessarily negative either. There's a lot of good stuff that shows up. He does a good job depicting Rico becoming more disciplined, becoming more aware of his surroundings, not just in a martial sense, but also in a social sense, and respecting not just tiers of command and the chain of command, but also respecting what the chain of command stands for, and the fact that this is an entire organization, a coherent organization that has in theory, at least in the case of the book, the best intentions of mankind at heart. And like I said, what comes across is a rather hostile universe. So he does a good job with that, and the officers that he interacts with, the other enlisted men that he interacts with, all come across very realistically in the limited engagements that the reader has with them. So, cool stuff. Very good. The book, after he finishes his training in boot camp, it progresses on to his deployment. He explains that they don't even know specifically why they're going to war until they're already well on their way to deployment. They didn't even hear about the Buenos Aires attack until they're already en route to bombing some planet. He describes several military events and campaigns. And we can go into that, but I'm not going to. It's all pretty cool and worth reading yourself. But that's pretty much my thoughts on the book. It's good, detailed, better than I expected. I went into it expecting not to like it, especially after the first 2 chapters. I'm like, I'm not going to like this book. It's not highbrow enough or whatever. It's rather simplistic and straight to the point, which there's not much for me to chew on thematically. But by the end of chapter 3 or 4, I'm like, all right, yeah, I'm hooked. It's easy to read, and it's cool. There's a lot of cool stuff in it, and that's why I said, as young adult novels go, you can do a lot worse than Starship Troopers. This is ideal, I think, for a 12 to 14-year-old, probably guy, boy, reading it for some literature curriculum or civics credit, actually. Maybe not civics, because it will get them thinking about civics. It'll get them thinking about certain aspects of political theory at a superficial level, but at that age, that's fine. And also delivering a good story at the same time, a good coming-of-age story. Rico is he enters boot camp rather immature, but he ends up going all the way through officer training. By the end of it, coming out very competent and a cool guy, the kind of soldier that you would want to serve under if you were so inclined. So, good book. I recommend it. Now, very briefly, in the time I've got left here, the movie. I've only seen the first movie. I haven't seen the others. Trash. Crap. It takes this book, which does have thought put into it, does have an extreme attention to detail and a thoroughness and an interest in depicting these things realistically, for the most part, even though we're talking about space mecha mobile suits that can pitch nuclear bombs out to the horizon. Still, Heinlein spends deliberate time describing these things so that the audience can grasp the kind of warfare that he's envisioning. The movie throws all that in the trash. The movie is... I understand that the movie's shot the way it's supposed to be propaganda, and it's supposed to be ironic, and it's supposed to be depicting this fascist state because they wear black trench coats. I guess that makes it fascist. They wear black trench coats, and they're in the army. And it simplifies everything down. But in so doing, it stops being the story that's being told, for one thing, and instead gives you just what's little more than just a popcorn flick, but an insulting one at that. It's an insult to the audience. It's trying to insult its audience, which makes it a bad movie. I think this is doubly so when you consider the fact that, again, the book trying to depict things relatively realistically. When you finish high school and you go out into the world, whether you go to enter into the military or you go to college or a trade school or you just get a job, the people that you went to high school with, you're probably not going to see a whole lot of them ever again. You might, maybe 1 or 2, but very unlikely you'll see any of them again. The book is like that. You see that in the book. In the movie, not only does he continue to see his best buddies that he went to high school with, his social studies teacher is the guy that he's serving under in his squad, which is ridiculous, completely insane. The guns they use in the movie don't even have iron sights. They're not looking where they're shooting, which again, the attention to detail in the book, pages spent describing the military technology and the tactics with which they use this tech, completely thrown out the window in the movie, insultingly so. Like it's like the movie's basically trying to get you to hate it, but knowing that you're a cow that's going to be led around by the nose into any popcorn bin that's in front of you, and it's insulting. It's just a derogatory film. So, on top of that, minor issues regarding the film, I think the film looks kind of cheap. Yeah, even though they spent so much money on the special effects, the bugs look great in the movie. I have to admit, they did a really good job with that. But the ships, the sets on the ships, something about the lighting is a little just too bright. It looks like a TV show when they're on the ships. And the guns that they have just look like plastic toys from like Toys R Us. They don't look good. The armor that the infantry wear, I know they're not wearing the mobile suit stuff, which you can criticize them for that. I think they could have made the movie without those and still kind of made it work somehow, but they didn't even try. They just gave them stuff that looks like, they spray painted some hockey pads and got some little wind up phaser toys from Toys R Us or something like that. It just looks cheap. It doesn't look right. It doesn't look right at all. And then there's also this bizarre casting decisions with Rico, who's not Argentinian in the book. He's I think he lives there, but his background is Filipino. I mean, at the end of the book, he speaks something in Tagalog. And they cast him as Casper Van Dien, who does a fine job. It's fine enough job. I think the performances of the movie were all right. It's just the whole movie itself sucks. It's not what the book is presenting whatsoever. And I think if you like the movie, no accounting for taste, I guess. But that's that. That is about a half an hour of me rambling about Starship Troopers. Long story short, it's good. Don't watch the movie. If you have kids, get them to read this when they're the right age and engage with them about it. Talk to them about it, because there is plenty of stuff in here you can engage with and talk about with kids. But yeah, like I said at the beginning, young adult novel, you could do way worse than Starship Troopers. You might be able to do better, don't know, but you could certainly do a lot worse. So that's it. Hopefully we don't go quite as long this time in between episodes. As I said before, I had originally recorded this episode about 2 months ago and was displeased with how it turned out, so I wanted to re-record it, which is good because it gave me more time to sort of let my thoughts on Starship Troopers ferment and get it a bit more cohesive and coherent of a presentation. I'm not sure what the next episode is going to be on yet. Hopefully it will be out in a couple of weeks. We'll see what happens. And if you are interested in other things that we're talking about with books, feel free to listen to the other project that I'm doing with Mr. James Clark over at the Bookcast AD. That's what we've decided to name that. These are two different projects. This is more aligned with The Pillarist. That one is just a thing he and I are doing for fun. We read a book and then come back together roughly every month and talk about that book. Those are usually, we're trying to keep a theme of sort of religious themed books with that one. This is much more off the cuff and less thought out, and it's going to be just whatever books I feel like talking about, or film. The next one might be about a film. I've been watching some very good movies lately, so we'll see. Anyway, if you made it this far, I just want to extend my gratitude. Thank you for listening, and you can find my work over at thepillarist.com or here on whichever platform you're listening to this on. I hope you have a wonderful day, wonderful week, wonderful month, and I will see you next time. Have a good one.